All right, thank you everybody for coming tonight. Obviously, I'm not Bill Brown, who usually does this role. I am David Demore. I'm a professor of political science at UNLV. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Government Studies, like Molly. So this is actually the last of the Brookings Scholars Lecture this year, so thank you for coming. So Molly's going to talk to us tonight a little bit about her title of her talk is essentially looking at the conflict between Republican-led states and the Republican-led Washington, D.C. Where are the fault lines, what we've already seen, as well as what we might see in the future here. This is what, your second trip out here?
It is my second trip out.
So Molly's second trip out there. She is the author of a book on the filibuster, Expectations to the Rule, about the politics of filibuster, limitations in the U.S. Senate, which explores basically how Congress tried to get around their own rules to pass legislation. Most recently, we saw that with the tax legislation that came out in last year there. And of course, that's how Obamacare got passed as well, way back when here. Her current research projects include work on the congressional budget process, the consequences of partisan dynamics on how the budget actually works and does not work more often, and how federalism in the consequences of federalism on national policy making during the era of a unified Republican Party control in Washington, D.C. Molly received her PhD in political science and public policy from the University of Michigan and her BA in government from Smith College. Prior to working at, actually we're at Brookings before. Mm-hmm. She was working as a research coordinator in the government studies program in Brookings. She's also done some teaching at Jordan Nation. She did some teaching today in my class, in fact. So we'll turn it over to Molly.
Great, thanks Dave, and thank you all for coming. It's really great to be back here at UNLV. I am really excited about how warm it is outside. So it's definitely still winter when I left the East Coast, so that's been a lovely change. And tonight, as Dave said, I'm going to be talking about some work on a new project that's actually joint work with one of my Brookings colleagues, Elizabeth Mann, and we're calling it When Interests Collide. And it's on sources and areas of conflict between Republican-led states and Republicans at the national level. And just to tell you a little bit about how we got started on this project. The idea first came to us in the aftermath of the 2016 election. I actually was looking in preparation for this lecture at all of my files from the project, and I think our very first notes on this project are from the week after the 2016 election, when the very emergent, immediate conventional wisdom was, once Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency in 2017, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is sort of dead from day one. And we sort of took a look at that conventional wisdom and started to think, maybe that's not quite true. As we all know, I'm going to talk quite a lot about the ACA tonight. As we all know, it's ultimately still alive in some form. But part of why we thought initially that it might survive is because of the existence of a number of states, including states led by Republicans, where the ACA was working and had been implemented to full effect. And so Elizabeth does a lot of work on the state-based implementation of federal policy. I do a lot of work on Congress, so this seems like a natural place for us to work together. So to start us off, I'm going to walk us through 4 events from 2017. Many of them, if not all of them, will be familiar to you because they all involve your governor, Brian Sandoval. So the first comes from January of 2017. And in January of 2017, Governor Sandoval, at the very beginning of January, sends a letter to House Republican leaders indicating that they should, any changes they make to the Affordable Care Act should make sure to leverage the advancements that were already made. Later in the month, he joins, so Governor Sandoval is the vice chair of the National Governors Association. He joins the other governors in sending another letter that is more specifically about Medicaid and asks that if Congress is considering changes to Medicaid, it need to continue to have a big federal role and to take advantage of the Medicaid expansion that had happened under the Affordable Care Act. So we see very immediately some pushback from Republican governors against repealing the ACA. Republicans in Congress, on the other hand, go full speed ahead, setting up, this is a picture from a vote in the Senate in January of 2017, to sort of set forth the framework to be able to repeal the ACA under filibuster-proof procedures. So, first example of Republican governors going one way, Republicans in Congress going the other. Let's fast forward to June. At this point, the House, after a couple false starts, has successfully passed a bill repealing the ACA. Governor Sandoval joins 6 other governors to, again, send a letter, this time about the bill that the House has actually passed. Again, focusing largely on the Medicaid provisions. Says the Medicaid provisions are particularly problematic. He also has this relatively notorious press conference with Senator Heller, who, given the lighting here, is sort of in the shadows over there, which seems sort of appropriate. But it's this press conference where Governor Sandoval and Senator Heller indicate that the approach that the House is taking is unacceptable. Republicans in Congress, again at this point in the Senate, continue to go full speed ahead. There was a thought for a while that the Senate might take a different tack than the House. They ultimately introduce a bill in the Senate that looks quite a lot like the House bill. President Trump had called that House bill mean in June. The Senate chooses to take a very similar approach despite hearing this pushback from governors. So in July, we see, again, Governor Sandoval joined this time 9 other governors to oppose the emerging Senate proposal on the ACA. So this letter, which is to the Senate leaders, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, not only indicates their displeasure with the Medicaid provisions, but it also specifically says that the Senate should reject this skinny repeal proposal, which, if you were watching the debate, was this idea that the Senate would do kind of the bare minimum merely for legislative momentum purposes. The Senate would just pass something so that this process could continue. The Senate, again, disregards this position from the governors, tries to pass this skinny repeal bill. This is a picture of John McCain just before he gives his thumbs down to vote no. You can see Mitch McConnell off there in the background looking very displeased about what's happening. But again, this is sort of the third example of where there is pressure from governors to go in one direction and Congress at least tries to go in the other. And then I'm going to end this kind of lead up with something that happened in September, which is that, so Congress goes on recess in August, they all go home. At the beginning of recess, they all seem sort of resigned to the idea that they're done working on this. They start to hear from constituents, particularly well-placed Republican constituents, that no, they really need to take one more crack at trying to repeal the ACA in 2017. At the beginning of September, there's a kind of key, wonky, but important event where basically the Senate parliamentarian, whose job is to provide guidance to the senators on what the rules say, basically says, all right, senators, if you want this chance to repeal the ACA under these procedures that protect the bill from a filibuster, you have to finish it by the end of September. If you don't finish it by the end of September, and you want to do another bill that is exempt from a filibuster after the 1st of October, you only get one shot. And you want to use that shot for a tax bill, so you've got to make a choice. Either hurry up and do a health care bill now, or try to do health care and a tax bill together after October 1st. There was no real sense that that part of the plan would work. So that really kind of lit a fire under Republicans for one last shot at doing this. This is, again, a letter from Governor Sandoval and 9 other governors. indicating that they opposed the plan that was emerging for this last-ditch effort. It's a proposal that I'll refer to as the Graham-Cassidy proposal. Alternatively, Graham, Cassidy, Heller, and Johnson. Those were the 4 Republican senators who were prominently involved in pushing this. Again, Senate tries quite hard to do the opposite of what these governors are requesting. They ultimately realize they don't have the votes. You can see Bill Cassidy, senator from Louisiana, looking pretty glum on the far side of that picture. September ends, and with it, any real serious legislative effort at repealing the ACA. So these are kind of 4 key moments in the process of this ACA repeal fight from last year. And at all of them, we saw governors wanting one thing, including some Republican governors. Governor Sandoval was not the only one. We also saw prominent activism from Governor Kasich of Ohio, Governor Baker of Massachusetts, Governor Scott of Vermont, and Governor Hogan of Maryland, Republicans all. And they were diverging from their national co-partisans, national Republicans, on this major policy issue. So just to give you a little sense of where we're going with the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we should think about this behavior by Sandoval and other Republican governors. And I'm going to bring in some political science research from kind of a couple different areas of the field that will help us think about this. I'm going to talk about what we actually saw happen in 2017. So I gave some highlights using the example of Governor Sandoval, but I'm going to present some data that Elizabeth and I have been collecting on more systematically what's been happening. Also going to draw some comparisons to previous health policy debates. In this talk, I'm going to talk mainly about a law that was passed in 1997, creating the Children's Health Insurance Program. As Elizabeth and I continue to work on this project, we're also going to be comparing this case in 2017 to major legislation in 1995 and the original passage of the ACA. And then I'm also going to talk at the end about a little bit of what we should watch going forward. What are some other both areas of tension in the healthcare area, and what are some other policy areas where we are seeing this tension between Republican governors and a Republican national government. So before I do that, I want to just remind us quickly sort of why the ACA is a really interesting case to study this tension between national and state level Republicans. And it's in large part because the ACA is set up in such a way that responsibility for implementing it is shared between the federal government and state governments. So one major area of this is the Medicaid expansion. So under a Supreme Court decision in 2012, states could not be required to expand Medicaid. As of today, there are 32 states that have chosen to do so. There are a couple states, including Virginia and I think Utah, that are now considering expansions. And this set of 32 states includes 11 states that had a Republican governor at the time, excuse me, they chose to expand. Another area where responsibility is shared between states and the federal government is in the marketplaces. And these are these websites that individuals use to purchase coverage on the individual market and to access the subsidies that they might have available to them from the federal government to do so. Under a 2015 Supreme Court decision, individuals can access those subsidies whether or not a marketplace is created by an individual state or maintained by the federal government, and the law gives states the option of choosing whether or not to create their own marketplace or leave it to the federal government to do so. A third way in which responsibility is shared here is through what we call waivers. And basically, waivers are the ability of individual states to apply for permission from the federal government for some flexibility in how they implement the law. So there's long-standing waiver authority under Medicaid, where states can ask the federal government for flexibility in implementing Medicaid in their states. There's also provisions in the ACA that are specific to some of the ACA's state-based provisions, where basically states, if they can justify that they'll cover as many people and that it will cost no more to the federal government, they can access some flexibility. So this is all to say that the ACA provides, because it creates a shared responsibility for implementation between states and the federal government, it provides us with an interesting way to study this dynamic. So one possibility is that the same set of things that predicted how individual states implemented the ACA in the first place will be the things that predict whether we see Republican tension between governors and the federal government. So the first thing we know about how states chose to implement the ACA is that it's largely a partisan story. So the biggest predictor of whether a state was going to oppose particularly expanding Medicaid was whether the state's governor was a Republican and whether Republicans controlled the legislature. This partisan story also helps explain how fast states went. So Democratic-led states that chose to expand Medicaid generally went faster than Republican-led states. And this is important, but it doesn't really help us understand why we saw some governors, like Governor Sandoval, choose to push back against the feds in 2017, because this would suggest that they would have simply gone along with what the federal level Republicans were doing. So there are other things, though, that mattered, and these might help us understand better what some of the source of this tension was. So one thing that seemed to matter quite a bit for predicting whether a state was going to expand Medicaid in particular was how strong was organized business support in the state for the decision to expand. The presence of pro-expansion healthcare providers was also a driver, and states that had existing higher levels of Medicaid benefits also tended to move faster in expanding. Interestingly, there's little evidence that maybe what we would call need drove decision-making at the state level about how to implement the ACA. So there's not a lot of evidence that states with higher uninsured populations, or where there were more high-need hospitals, or states with lower per capita incomes, they didn't seem to expand Medicaid or be more aggressive in implementing the ACA. So another possibility is that this is an electoral story, that it's not necessarily about the ACA specifically, but it's more broadly about whether governors, what their electoral situation is. So one possible explanation here would be that governors are afraid of being blamed for their national colleagues' decision to cut benefits. So if Republicans in Congress decide to cut Medicaid, governors might be afraid that that is going to affect them negatively in their reelection efforts. So for this to be true, for governors' kind of concern in this area to be well-founded, voters would need to be able to distinguish between which level of government is actually responsible for something. So if voters can tell that governors are doing one thing and the federal government is doing something else, then maybe governors don't need to be worried about this. But if voters are bad at that and are just going to conflate what's happening at the national level with what's happening at the state level, then maybe governors should be more concerned. And what we know from the literature is that voters can make these distinctions, but only sometimes and only in certain circumstances. Things like voters who are pretty well informed can generally tell the difference between which level of government is responsible for what thing. If they're kind of reminded of or cued into which level, they can generally effectively report back in a survey, that sort of thing. So this suggests to me that there's a real possibility that if something was happening at the national level, that governors might legitimately be blamed by voters for what was happening. So a second possibility is that what happens in state level elections is just really about what's happening at the federal level. And so a different way to put this is it's really just what's happening with the president all the way down. There's some pretty interesting work that suggests that state legislators of electoral fate is largely determined by presidential approval. There's also some evidence that voters will punish the president's party at the ballot box, even for things like local tax increases that the voters themselves enacted through a ballot measure. So this is to suggest that there's sort of the nationalization of electoral politics might be playing a role here. There's also some work that suggests that when responsibility for a particular policy area is shared, voters will just blame whichever level of government is controlled by the other party. So if you are a Republican in a Republican-controlled state and there's a Democratic president and there's a policy area where they share responsibility, you're just going to blame the Democrats and the Democratic president for what's happening, not your own party members. And so this could really cut both ways for governors in 2017. On one hand, if Republican governors think that Republican voters will like that national level Republicans were fulfilling this long-held Republican campaign promise, they might reward governors for a repeal of the ACA in this setup. But if voters don't like the repeal of the ACA, then they might just choose to punish governors anyway because they're unhappy with what the federal level office holders are doing. So the last thing I want to touch on before I show you some data is what do we know about the ACA and political behavior specifically? So there's some good work that suggests, on one hand, that Medicaid beneficiaries are significantly less likely to register, to vote, to take other kinds of political action. There's also some evidence that the Medicaid expansion increased political participation, but that's both increasing turnout among new beneficiaries and a backlash effect among conservatives who were unhappy about states having expanded Medicaid. It's also not clear that these effects really persisted past 2014. So what this evidence suggests to us is that it's probably not the case that governors were really concerned about specific electoral punishment from the population who benefited the most from the Medicaid expansion, but that the other evidence suggests that there may be some electoral and political motivation going on here. So one of the things that we did to kind of start this project is just try to get a sense of, well, how active were governors on this issue in 2017? So this is a graph of all 50 governors. And along the bottom are the number of newspaper articles that mentioned one of the governors and his or her position on repeal and replace between January and September of 2017. The red bars are Republican governors. The blue bars are Democratic governors. Alaska has an independent governor. That's the green bar. There are roughly 900 newspaper articles that we looked at in this analysis. And you'll see, first of all, that there's lots of variation. So the governor at the top of the list is John Kasich of Ohio, who was mentioned in more than 100 newspaper articles about repeal and replace. The governor of Hawaii was mentioned 0 times. Don't have a great explanation for that, but we see a lot of variation here. We also see, for example, that 6 of the top 10 most frequently mentioned governors were Republicans. And this is a mix of people who supported repeal and who opposed repeal. So number 1 and 2 are Governors Kasich and Sandoval, who are both repeal opponents. Governor Baker of Massachusetts is number 3. Number 4 is Governor Doug Ducey of Arizona, who was a prominent repeal supporter. We also see in the top 10 Governor Hutchinson of Arkansas, who was a repeal supporter, and Governor LePage of Maine, who was a repeal supporter. So this is interesting data to look at. It really gives us a sense of how much variation there was among governors across both parties in this debate. But what can it tell us about whether these electoral incentives seem to matter? So I want to focus here on the 17 Republican governors in 2017 who led states that expanded Medicaid. So within this group of 17, there were 5 governors who were term limited and can't run again. And we would think that might be important because if you can't run again, you're going to have really different electoral incentives. Basically, you're not running for re-election, so it matters less to you personally what's happening because you're not going to be on the ballot again. There were 7 governors in this group who were running for re-election in 2018. So these are the governors who we think might be most sensitive to any electoral incentives. And then there are 5 governors in this group who aren't running in 2018, either because their state doesn't have a gubernatorial election in 2018 or because they had simply chosen not to run. So the most active group here were the term limited governors. So these 5 governors who were term limited and couldn't run again, they averaged about 40 mentions. A lot of that is driven by Sandoval and Kasich, both of whom are term limited, and we're at the very top of that graph that I showed. The second most active group were these governors who were running for re-election, who we thought might be most sensitive to electoral incentives. So this includes proponents of repeal, like Ducey and Hutchinson. Ducey notably was a proponent of repeal and tried to persuade John McCain to also be a proponent of repeal. He famously called John McCain the night of that failed vote in the Senate and told him it was okay to vote for repeal. This group of governors who were running for re-election also includes Governors Baker, Hogan, and Scott, who are all opponents. So we see both groups of governors being both sides of the issue being active in this group. This group averaged about 28 mentions in that graph. And then the governors who simply weren't running in 2018 and weren't term limited, they averaged about 15 mentions. So this suggests to us that there is something about an electoral story happening, that some of the behavior we see is consistent with governors responding to the electoral incentives that are in front of them. So what about sort of policy effects? You know, there are a couple different ways this might work. One would be, kind of what we would like to be true in an ideal world, which is that if a state is going to be hurt by repeal, electoral incentives aside, a governor of that state should oppose repeal. Whereas if a state might benefit from repeal, electoral incentives aside, the governor should advocate for that. Another possibility is that states that were going to be really hurt by repeal, that they might have particularly active interest group coalitions that would be pushing the governor to oppose repeal. If you think back to when I talked about some of the work that looks at why the ACA was implemented in the way it was in the first place, one big factor there was whether sort of hospitals and other business groups were really pushing for expansion. So this is some data that Elizabeth and I put together in September when the Senate was thinking about this Graham-Cassidy Heller-Johnson proposal. And what that proposal would have done was basically take the money that was that's currently available under the ACA, convert it into a block grant where it just goes to states as a big chunk of money, with states having some ability just to decide how that money was spent. And it would also implement certain caps on Medicaid spending. And so the Kaiser Family Foundation took a look at what the projections and the projected changes for different states would be under this proposal. So on this graph, the right side is states that would benefit from the change. The left side are states that would lose from the change. And it's in billions of dollars. And then the bars, red bars are governors who came out against this proposal. Green bars are governors who came out for the proposal. And then the gray bars are governors who didn't make a public statement about it. including the governor of Texas, where the proposal was written such that it would potentially benefit Texas quite significantly. So if we look at the pattern here, we can see that all of the governors who came out against this proposal were from states that were projected to lose out. So that's the governors of Maryland, Massachusetts, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, Ohio, and Vermont. On the supporting the proposal side, we see it cut both ways. So we see some governors who were projected to whose states were projected to benefit coming out in support, but we also see some governors whose states were projected to lose coming out in support of the proposal, including again our friends governors Ducey and Hutchinson, who are again in that group of governors who are running for re-election in 2018. So was 2017 unusual? Was kind of the level of activity that we saw governors engage in different than past healthcare debates over issues that have shared federal and state responsibility? The short answer, at least when we're comparing 2017 to 1997 and the creation of the Children's Health Insurance Program, is yes. So remember I told you that there were about 900 mentions of governors and their positions on ACA repeal in newspaper articles in 2017. There were a total of 24 mentions of governors in relation to the creation of CHIP in 1997. The highest number there is Governor Lawton Chiles of Florida, who was mentioned 4 times. So if you think about that in comparison to the over 100 times that Governor Kasich was mentioned in 2017, we do see a big difference here. So what are maybe some of the reasons for that difference? So one is that in 2017, we had unified Republican control at the national level, whereas in 1997, there was divided control at the national level. Republicans controlled Congress, and there was a Democratic president in the White House. And this may have led governors in 1997 to think, we need to be less active on this issue because we know that divided government at the federal level might produce a compromise that reflects a mix of Democratic and Republican preferences better. As opposed to 2017, when unified government potentially had the ability for Republicans to implement something that was on a more party line basis. Another reason that we might have seen this difference is that in 1997, we were looking at a prospective new program, a gains for governors, whereas in 2017, we were looking at the prospect of big losses for some governors. And one thing we know from sort of the psychology literature is that people tend to be more sensitive to losses than they are to gains. And so if we're thinking about kind of the downstream electoral consequences, voters might be more aware of losses that they incurred in 2017, and that would trickle up to governors who felt the need to be more active. The 1997 legislation was bipartisan from the start. The 2 biggest champions of it were Senator Kennedy of Massachusetts, a Democrat, and Senator Hatch of Utah, a Republican. It was also a much smaller change, so again, governors may not have felt the need to be quite as active. And it had very popular potential beneficiaries. It's really politically popular to insure kids. This is a quote from the governor of Nevada in 1997, who pointed out that governors welcomed the opportunity to build on their previous successes in extending health insurance to more kids. So one of the things that we're going to be working on in this project is continuing to explore some of these explanations for what makes some of these cases different than others. So just to sort of conclude, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we should watch going forward. So we think there's probably little reason to expect that governors' behavior in 2017 was driven by a really specific concern that they would be punished electorally by Medicaid beneficiaries if the federal government made these big sweeping changes to Medicaid. But an electoral story that emphasizes the broader place of the ACA in national politics is more likely. So the idea that governors, even governors in states that would have lost out from the law that was proposed in 2017, if those were governors who were up for re-election this year in deep red states like Arkansas, those governors might have felt, because of the overall national political environment, it was the politically optimal thing to do to come out against or in favor of repeal, I should say. Whereas we saw several of the governors who came out against repeal are Republican governors from bluer states like Maryland and Massachusetts, where the ACA is broadly popular. And then there's some suggestive evidence that these policy effects may have played a role, that governors were paying attention to what actually would have happened in their states and were responding by pushing back against the federal government because of that. So what else should we pay attention to going forward in this area? So now that we've seen what's the likely end of major legislative efforts to repeal the ACA, where else might we see state-federal tension in the healthcare area? So a couple things to watch here is Massachusetts, which is a state with a Republican governor, is currently proposing adopting a drug formulary, which basically means a list of prescription drugs that Medicaid would cover. Currently that's not permitted as part of Medicaid. And this seems like the kind of thing that a conservative administration would be interested in approving. It's very focused on controlling costs, that sort of thing. But the Trump administration has expressed skepticism about approving Massachusetts' request to do this. So that's one kind of interesting case of tension that we might watch. The other is in Idaho, where the state of Idaho has a proposal to basically allow insurance companies to sell health insurance plans that don't comply with the ACA. Again, given the Trump administration's hesitancy about the ACA, we might think they would be excited about this prospect, but they've so far been a little lukewarm towards it. They've basically said that Idaho can't do exactly what it wants, maybe it can do something else that might have similar effects. But again, these are two Republican-led states that are pushing back and in some conflict with the federal government on health policy. What are some other policy areas that we might watch here? So one that Elizabeth and I have written a little bit about that we're paying attention to is education. So if we think back to the confirmation of Betsy DeVos to be the education secretary about a year ago, that was very contentious, in part because there were Republican senators, two of whom, Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, ended up voting against DeVos, who heard from a lot of their constituents that Secretary DeVos's pro-charter school, pro-school choice agenda would not necessarily work well for states with large rural populations. And so that's one place where we might see more tension. And then lastly is some interesting environmental policy areas. So we saw, I think earlier this year, the Trump administration propose to expand offshore drilling. And immediately, the state of Florida said, we don't want this. Again, it's Florida, led by Republican Governor Rick Scott. And then the Trump administration changed its proposal to exempt Florida from the expansion. So again, lots of interesting places to watch as Republican-led states either go along with or push back against what the federal government is up to. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Molly. Questions for Molly?
Yeah.
Was there significant supernational reaction to the repeal of the individual mandate at all?
So in December, when so as part of the tax bill that was passed in December, Republicans were successful at repealing the individual mandate. We haven't collected the newspaper data, but from just kind of paying attention to this, I don't think there was nearly as much, and there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the individual mandate doesn't necessarily have effects that differ a lot across states because everyone was subject to it. So it's not the case that because you live in Nevada, which has expanded Medicaid, versus living in a state that hasn't, you're going to feel really different effects of the policy. The other reason is because the individual mandate was far and away the least popular part of the Affordable Care Act. People hate being told they have to do things like buy insurance. And so even as other parts of the law grew in popularity in the face of Republican efforts to repeal it last year, so we saw things like the protections for pre-existing conditions become more popular and that sort of thing. Support for the individual mandate never really got more popular. And so even for governors who are generally in favor of keeping the Medicaid expansion and other parts of the ACA, it would be a pretty hard political lift to come out in favor of the least popular part of the law. Yeah?
What was the impact of the Freedom Coalition in Congress and their impact on the states where they were present?
It's a good question. And one thing that we did a little bit of work on and never really came to a clear explanation of was, so there were Freedom Caucus members from a number of states who were pushing for this amendment that is ultimately part of what got the bill across the finish line in the House that would provide state-based flexibility. And in that case, we saw some House members who weren't part of the Freedom Caucus align with the Freedom Caucus, despite the fact that it would be quite unpopular in their states. So I think at the end of the day, a big part of this story is just that this was a major Republican policy promise that folks in Congress really felt like they had to follow through on, and they were willing to do, in some cases, kind of whatever it took legislatively to try and get across the finish line. But it's an interesting thing to think about, and I think the Freedom Caucus was quite influential in how this went through Congress. Yeah.
I want to say a question, but I don't know how to word it right, so maybe you can help me.
I can do my best.
What do you think about political figures that are in politics for like a long time, and then they try to use that stuff for their benefit? But like, for example, the healthcare that you were talking about that one. But let's say that they were against it, but they said they were for it, and then later on they said that they were against it. Do you think that the longer you are in politics, the less that works in your favor?
So I certainly think the longer one's political career lasts, the more likely it is you're going to find yourself in situations that pressure you to take one position versus a different position.
Yeah, like Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. So I mean, this was quite famously happened to John Kerry in the 2004 presidential election. He was for it, and then he was against it, and he was accused of flip-flopping. So I think just the longer you have a political career, the more likely that is to come up. And then the question of, well, does it matter, is really going to depend on your particular electoral situation at a given time. So it'll be really interesting, for instance, to watch whether Senator Heller's going from being against repeal to being pretty aggressively pro-repeal over the span of just a couple of months in 2017, whether that has any implications for his ability to win re-election here in Nevada this year. And I don't know. You all are more Nevada political experts than I am, but that'll be, I think, an interesting thing to watch. Yeah, you're welcome.
Good question.
Yeah.
So right now, the federal government's still paying a big chunk of the Medicaid expansion. Do you think these attitudes are going to change as the states are required to pick up more of the tab?
I think that's potentially true. One of the things that was really interesting to watch governors take a position on, and senators from states, Republican senators from states that had expanded Medicaid, was during the debate over how long the period over which the Medicaid expansion would phase out would be. So there was, will it phase out over 5 years? Will it phase out over 10 years? That sort of thing. And I do think it's possible that as states become more responsible for covering more of the Medicaid expansion, it will become less popular. But at the same time, I think many people regard the Medicaid expansion as the most successful part of the law. And particularly as it's also proven to be a part of the law that's been less susceptible to kind of administrative change at the federal level. That's changing a little bit with the push towards implementing work requirements for Medicaid, which the Trump administration has started to do administratively. But it'll certainly be interesting to watch, and including, to get back to something I mentioned in the talk, the fact that there are some of these governors who were the highest profile supporters of keeping the Medicaid expansion won't still be in office. They're term limited out. So it's hard to say kind of what the next order consequences of what we're looking at here will be. But I do, one of the big takeaways that I think we've had from this project so far is that this activism by governors was really relevant in the debate.
All right, I got another one for you.
Okay, go for it.
So do you think part of the struggles for Republicans, repeal was the easy part, but the replace part? Because, at the end of the day, this is started as a Republican idea as the alternative to Clinton care.
Yes,
Romney
yes.
is the first to do it in Massachusetts.
Yeah, so I do think, and if we go back all the way to the beginning of the talk, when I talk about what happened in January of 2017, this question of whether Republicans were going to repeal and replace at the same time, or repeal now and replace later, was actually a big sticking point. And from my perspective, that was kind of the place where things really started to go off the rails for Republican efforts. I don't think that Republicans, particularly Paul Ryan in the House, thought he was going to have as much trouble as he did uniting his caucus behind kind of a grand strategy, not even the particulars. So there was one part of the Republican conference in the House who said, if we repeal the bill now, but give ourselves 2 years to come up with a replacement, we're never actually going to repeal the bill. We're going to say we did it, but we're just going to keep kicking the can down the road. There was another part of the House Republican Conference who said, if we repeal the bill now without a replacement, we're never actually going to replace the law. And the sort of that first group tended to be kind of the Freedom Caucus types. That second group tended to be more moderate establishment Republicans. And together, they had enough votes to basically force some sort of agreement, which ended up being, we're going to repeal and replace at the same time, which proved to be really hard to do. Yes?
You're dealing with Congress, you're dealing with the governors. Do you think voters are even cognizant of any of this?
So, I mean, I think that because the ACA was sort of a high enough profile issue, that I do think that registered with a lot of voters, that there was activity on this issue, that there was the potential that the law was going to be repealed. Whether voters were actually distinguishing between what the governors wanted and what Congress wanted, I think am also sort of skeptical, and I think a lot of the research I talked about supports me in that skepticism. But to the extent that voters would identify what was happening with Republicans, I think they are definitely capable of doing that, but not necessarily assigning credit or blame specifically across the levels of government.
Any other questions for Molly? All right, we can all get home and get the hockey game starts in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to ask you a marijuana question, but I'll save you from that.
Save it for John.
Well, he was already here, so that seems to be another battleground, although,
Yeah,
particularly as it expands, and you mentioned class
I
today.
did. It is interesting.
I know when we got our new attorney, our U.S. attorney here, we met with the governor, and he's like, My whole budget's built on this thing.
When I recently did the Federalism Week in the class I'm teaching at George Mason, and we talked about marijuana and the huge banking challenges.
Very good. Enjoyable.
Yeah, that's
Thank
the big
you.
one.
I actually have an extremely jaundiced view